Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's research seminar. I'm quite excited to see here with me on the screen my ex-colleague, a very good friend, Kareen. Kareen and I, we work together at EBS, and she's currently, of course, the Vice Dean of Research at 𝐝𝐻�universität, and also heads a very interesting institute there, Impact Institute. We have always known Kareen as a very passionate social entrepreneurship researcher. And today we have her join us today for the talk on, let me just go through it. It's a very interesting topic on basically how social entrepreneurs from Germany and Switzerland, how do they sell their idea? And she's going to take us through the study that she is working on how they acquire resources, entrepreneurial resource acquisition, on the discursive construction of social entrepreneurship in the pitch that they make to the investors. So, Kareen, would you also let us know whether you would like to take questions at during the slides, or would you prefer to hold on towards the end of the webinar?
I'm fine with both. So, keep this interactive. So if, an idea or a question comes to your mind, just,
sure.
Ask right away. You don't have to wait until the end.
Sure. So people, just folks who can raise your hands using the reactions on the Zoom, or type in the chat box, and I'll keep monitoring it for Kareen. So thanks, Kareen, for joining us this morning your time and afternoon our time. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, for the kind invitation, and of course it's great to be in India, if only virtually. In Germany it's late in the morning, almost around noon. And I'm very excited to present one of my research projects today, which is on social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial resource acquisition. As you know, I said, if there are any questions, if there's anything that you're specifically interested in, or if you would like to learn more, feel free to interrupt me. My apologies if I don't see your hand. Sometimes I get carried away with my research.
No problem. I'll monitor it.
And so please don't feel ignored, and Ahmed will help me in keeping an eye on hands or chats or and everything if I should not be able to do that. So I'm very excited to present this paper, which is titled on the discursive construction of social entrepreneurship in pitch situations. Hopefully, the paper will be published soon in the Journal of Business Ethics. We are very close to that after 4 major revisions, so it was a very painful process. It's a single-authored paper, so I even had to go through that process on my own. And I will tell you a bit along the way also how the paper has developed and has changed in this process of revising it several times. So very brief, in a nutshell, what are we looking at? We're looking at social entrepreneurship, and I will explain a bit more what it is on the next slide. But most importantly, social entrepreneurship combines commercial elements with social elements. So you find these types of companies, enterprises, non-profit organizations that combine elements, commercial elements, with social elements. So they're trying to create social impact in an entrepreneurial way, with an entrepreneurial mindset. So by definition, they combine social and business elements. And the recent turn towards linguistics, specifically also in the resource acquisition literature, called attention to the role of pitching. So we set out to study pitches because they're a pivotal element in the entrepreneurial process for young and nascent companies. And we were interested to figure out in live pitches, which kind of discursive repertoire do use social entrepreneurs, but also their audiences. And in order to study this research question, we videotaped 49 pitches by social entrepreneurs at 5 different events in 2 incubators in Germany and Switzerland. And the important thing here is that we did not only videotape the pitches by the social entrepreneurs, but also the subsequent Q&A sessions, in order to get also data on the questions and the comments that the audience would ask. So social entrepreneurship, you know, is defined as using business logic in a novel and entrepreneurial way to improve the situation of, you know, beneficiaries or society as a whole. So social entrepreneurship tries to create positive social impact, positive social change for society. You find social enterprises, and Priya, I understand you study social entrepreneurship, so you know this already, but you find this in very different industries and branches. So you find social entrepreneurs in renewable energies, sustainable finance, housing, microfinance, sustainable and organic food, agriculture, fair trade movements, organic and sustainable clothing. So you see it's very widespread and very different industries and sectors. What they all have in common is this idea of combining entrepreneurial and social elements to create companies that ultimately serve the greater common good. So that companies that create this positive impact. In order to do so, of course, social entrepreneurs need resources. And when they need resources, such as financial, physical, human resources, but also intangible resources, for example, access to networks. And in order to get these resources, social entrepreneurs pitch. So they pitch their ventures in front of potential supporters, resource providers, investors, gatekeepers, to convince others of their idea. So this pitch situation is really a pivotal event and very decisive for the success of a social venture. And we know a bit about pitching in social entrepreneurship, also not too much. And what we find that also in pitching, we find social and business elements that are combined by social entrepreneurs. However, we really lack a coherent understanding of what actually happens in these pitch situations, and more specifically, how audience and social entrepreneurs interact and thus jointly construct our understanding of what social entrepreneurship actually is. Because we as academics can come out, you know, with very fancy definitions of social entrepreneurship. But in the end, it's these kind of pitch situations where resource providers decide whether to invest into a social enterprise, whether to you know, accept a social enterprise to a support program or to an incubator. So it's these kind of situations where the common sense making takes place into, is this a social enterprise or not? And is this you know, a legitimate social entrepreneur that we accept to this program? So these you know, situations are really the decisive element where we jointly construct this understanding of what is it actually social entrepreneurship, but also what is not social entrepreneurship, because that would be then the ventures and startups that do not get accepted and do not get support because they're not promising in terms of economic value creation or social value creation. In terms of methodology, so this is an inductive qualitative study. We collected data in 2 waves. The first in Switzerland in 1 pitch event, and then in 4 more pitch events at 2 different incubators in Germany. So we collected data in Zurich, in Hamburg, and Berlin. And we always videotaped the social entrepreneurs while they were pitching their idea. But we also, as I said earlier, videotaped the audiences reacting to these pitches, questioning and comments. In addition to that, we conducted in-depth interviews with the jury members and also in some instances with the pitchers. So we would ask them, you know, the pitchers, for example, why did you prepare this slide deck in the way you did? Why did you choose to present your venture in this way as opposed to another? And we also asked the jury members after the pitches, how did you perceive this pitch? Why did you evaluate it positively or negatively? For the sake of the first wave of data collection in Switzerland, we also have written material. So we have the sheets that the jury members would fill in when evaluating each pitch. And for the 4 more events in Germany where we collected data, we were able to get the presentation slides in addition to the video, to the material on video. So what we did then is that we transcribed all pitches, all the Q&A sessions, and all the interviews that we conducted, resulting in 370 pages of text. And then, informed by grounded theory, we began our analysis with a fine-grained reading of the data, and we wrote story sheets for each pitch. And then we try to understand what are the different, what are patterns, what are different concepts that are being used, and how can we subdivide this pitch into different elements. And we did that for each pitch, and then also for the text that was created by the audience and by with the interviews. We then coded the data using MaxQDA. First, we individually coded all the pitches, then all the statements made by the jury, and then we used that and to compare our analysis. And I will show you in a little bit how that resulted into in our analysis. We then realized that, and this is maybe not very surprising, that in these pitch situations, the pitchers themselves, but also their audience, would draw upon a social discourse and on a business discourse. And since the combination of these 2 elements is at the core of our understanding of social entrepreneurship, this is not very surprising. What was very surprising to me was the degree to which pitchers and audience would draw on these 2 discourses and how they actually did it, and how they would make sense of this concept of social entrepreneurship in these, by drawing in different ways on a social and on a business discourse. Then for each discourse, we identified concepts, object and subject positions in line with critical discourse analysis to provide a more detailed picture of these discourses that people would draw upon. After our first rounds of analysis, we held focus group-like presentations in which we presented our findings to team members from both incubators to get a reality check and to get their feedback and to get more insights into why they took certain decisions in terms of supporting one startup versus the other, and how their views had maybe changed on the pitches over time. So this is a short overview, the 7 pitches that we videotaped in Zurich. So very different branches also that we see here. So, a multi-generational house, a green energy company, urban vegan farming, a gamification app, climate-friendly meal initiative, a music business, a coaching program for refugees. So it's, from very, very different ideas. And these are the 37 pitches that we conducted in Berlin and Hamburg. The interesting part here is we also have data who was accepted to the incubation program. And we also know in each pitch event, one pitching team was recognized as the winner of this specific event. And then we set out in 2020 to look at which of these social enterprises actually survived, which of these startups has been successfully 7 years after the initial pitch. And we find that the jury judgments were not exactly good in foreseeing the success of these ventures. So we see that quite a few of the ventures that were negatively evaluated by the jury actually survived, and quite a number of ventures that were accepted to the program and received very positive evaluation did not survive, which maybe tells you something about the quality of these, these decisions that the jury took. Another important aspect to keep in mind is that very often the investors, gatekeepers, coaches, legal experts that support social entrepreneurs do not have a social background. And this was also the case here in all the pitch events that we observed for our study. So the members of the jury were startup experts, investors, business people, representatives from banks. So you had a lot of expertise on the business side, but you had almost none, if not zero, social expertise. And this is already one of our findings then, or this, you will see how this then later plays out and how the audience actually influences the way we think about social entrepreneurship. And in this case, the very, very business-oriented audience. So what we find is that both pitchers and audience draw upon a social discourse and upon a business discourse. To give you a bit of background, so the business discourse is, based on an ideology of profit maximizing strategies, and the emphasis here is on efficiency and profit. The social discourse is shaped by an ideology of values of inclusion, justice, and responsibility. And here the main emphasis is on the creation of social impact. And what we find, and unfortunately that was cut out of the paper during these revision rounds, and my heart is bleeding for that, but this is how the revision process goes, because what we did in an initial step is that we counted the words that the pitchers and the audience would use drawing on a business discourse versus a social discourse. And what we find there is that the pitchers use both a business and a social discourse. Many quite balanced, some primarily business, others primarily social. But the surprising finding is that the audience almost not at all would draw upon a social discourse. And if they did that, they used the social discourse in very different ways than the pitchers did. So apparently there was not much common ground on the social discourse between pitchers and audience. And I will explain that more in detail how that actually played out. So we see both pitchers and audience drawing on business and social discourse. The audience, however, much more using business discourse than social discourse, which can also be explained, by the fact that most of them have a business background in terms of education and professional experience. So we see that in the business discourse, the main concepts that were being used that we could identify in the texts were financial viability of the business model, a unique selling proposition, the concept of customers, the pricing, marketing, and commercial growth. On the contrary, for example, instead of using the term unique selling proposition and this idea, the social discourse would much more focus on the theory of change and the social impact that was created. They would use the term beneficiary, whereas in the business discourse, the idea was then that there's a customer. In the social discourse, there was talking about fair remuneration. So how could they create a pricing model, a comprehensive pricing model that would allow for fair remuneration of their suppliers? It was more about reaching beneficiaries than marketing, and it was more about scaling social impact than commercial growth. To give you a bit of an idea of this dichotomy between the social and the business discourse. But now, interestingly, you find that also the pitchers and the audiences draw on these discourses in different ways. So we find, for example, that in the social discourse, for the pitcher, the presenting the theory of change and the potential social impact of their startup was mostly about presenting the complexities of the social problem and their potential solution to it. Whereas the audience was more interested in the reach of the offer. So how many people are actually out there that could reach this. And maybe, aside from the, academic data analysis, it was almost painful for me to watch after, that we rewatched these films then over and over again of the pitches, how few, if not non-audience questions would actually critically question this theory of change, because there was simply no competence to do that. On the contrary, when we talked about, the financial viability of the business model, ideas like a market niche and so on, there were a lot of very qualified questions from the audience about these issues. Interestingly, for example, now you see how pitcher and audience draw on the business discourse in different ways if you look at the unique selling proposition. So the pitchers would emphasize how it differentiates its offers from other existing offers by other organizations. They wouldn't necessarily speak about competitors, because for them it was more partners in crime, right? Other organizations pursuing the same goal, maybe in different ways. Whereas the audience would always talk about the market and conquering the market and, a niche in the market, and how can you differentiate yourself against competitors. And there was a different way of how they made sense of the unique selling proposition, for example, within the business discourse from the pitcher side versus the audience side. Now, if we move on in this logic of a discourse that has a concept and a subject position and an object. So each of these, business discourses constructs an object and then subsequently a subject position. So a subject position would be a legitimate position to speak from within one discourse. So what kind of role can you take? What kind of legitimate role can you take within a given discourse? So starting with the object, which would here be, the startup that is being presented and discussed. Using a business discourse, the pitcher would then present their startups as a business. Very few did that, but some of them actually did that very coherently. So they talked about their startup as a business and framed the social cause as a business opportunity. So they say there is an opportunity for making money in this social problem. Very different from that, in the social discourse, the startup was presented as a social mission-driven organization. And the pitchers here would emphasize how the social mission and the social impact is the key defining factor for them for founding this venture. So this is, Priya, you do research on social entrepreneurial intentions. So they said, this is why I set out. I wanted to change the world. This is really my motivation to do this. Whereas the audience, even when staying within the social discourse, would rather refer to this as to these organizations as businesses who have a social side effect. And, interestingly, when the business discourse pitcher would frame the social cause as an opportunity for business, which was interestingly not done by the audience, but just by the pitchers, then in the social discourse, the pitcher would frame the social cause as a problem that urgently need to be addressed. And they would emphasize their own intrinsic motivation for social change. They said, look, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Some of them were personally affected by the problem, or they had family members who were affected by a certain disease, for example. And they said something has to be done about this. The audience, and you can see that in the questions and in the comments that they gave in the Q&A sessions, they were more searching for simple and innovative solutions to complex social problems. So they were not very much interested in understanding the complex problem itself, but they were rather expecting, this ready-made solution to effectively solve one of the biggest global challenges that we face. Maybe an expectation that, the pitchers could not easily fulfill, given the complexities about the problems that some of these pitching organizations were addressing. Think about climate change, environmental pollution, poverty, education, inclusion of migrant women in the business world, and stuff like that. So this is the way how within each discourse the object of the startup itself was created. When we talk about the subject position in each discourse, so the legitimate role, the legitimate position that the individual can speak from within a business discourse, obviously the pitcher is seen as an entrepreneur, and that's the only legitimate position that the pitcher can take. I'm an entrepreneur. Present yourself as a business person with strong implementation skills. And the audience, would agree. So the founders should be primarily entrepreneurs, and they were looking primarily for entrepreneurial skills and would ask questions that would allow them to figure out, is this an entrepreneurial personality or not? And are these this kind of proactive self-starters that we want to see? When drawing on the social discourse, and this refers primarily to self-descriptions of pitchers, many of them saw themselves actually not so much as business persons, but rather as social change makers and social innovators. So they would, self-identify as an activist and as a person for change. And the audience did not, mirror this very much. And if they would more focus on this idea of novel solutions that I also talked about earlier, that these social entrepreneurs should bring something new to the table to solve complex global problems that we hadn't seen before. So to give you, a bit more of a concrete example, we have the business discourse and we have the social discourse, and then we have pitchers and the audience who make sense of both in different ways. So the audience, when using a social discourse, they would primarily talk about a business with a social side effect. So still sidelining the social aspect. For example, one of the incubator employees said, in a pitch, I'm blown away by ideas where I realize it reaches out to a larger audience and there are new technical possibilities with social and sustainable effects. And when they employed and mobilized a business discourse, they would emphasize, this business model as the essential part. So only sufficient management knowledge and a solid business model can guarantee that the startup will survive. And they would primarily look for these entrepreneurial and management qualifications in a founder, rather than, his or her ability to bring about social change. The pitchers, when they mobilize the social discourse, they would emphasize the social impact as the key feature by saying, for example, our idea will improve the situation, we can bring about change. And when they mobilize the business discourse, they would emphasize this idea of the business model, rather by a business model that helps them to cover their costs. So they would say, yes, we have a solid business case, we can cover our costs, but they would not necessarily frame it in the same profit-driven way as their audience. So what does this tell us about social entrepreneurship and pitching in social entrepreneurship? So what can we learn from these findings? So our study highlights the discursive repertoire that social entrepreneurs and their audiences draw upon in pitching situations, and we show how they draw upon this repertoire in distinctively different ways. We find that actually many social entrepreneurs, intentionally or not, align their pitches, their presentations with the audience's dominant business discourse. So they're creating a shared space with their audience a shared rhetorical space, if you are, a shared discursive space where they meet their audience on an eye level. Whereas other social entrepreneurs, again, intentionally or not, choose not to enter this shared space from the beginning on, but rather than are drawn almost forcefully by the audience questions in the subsequent Q&A sessions to speak about these business aspects. So if they hadn't touched upon those aspects in the pitch, instead of following up maybe on the theory of change and on the solution they proposed, the audience almost, forcefully would force them to speak about those aspects of the business discourse by also using this kind of vocabulary and frame. And you could even see in the videos how some of these pitchers were apparently uncomfortable with talking about using phrases like return on investment or something, that for them was a business language that they were maybe not necessarily used to. So what we find is that in some instances, these social entrepreneurs would thus repackage their social logic in a business vocabulary. So for example, they would, instead of talking about how they served their beneficiaries and aimed for a social mission goal and for social impact, those stories were then repackaged into stories of attracting customers and pursuing commercial growth. So you can almost see how some social entrepreneurs dress up in a way to please their business-driven audience. So almost like a chameleon that can change colors, they change the color to fit the preferences of the audience that they're presenting and pitching their idea to. Paradoxically, and that's the interesting aspect, I believe in our study, that when we interviewed the jury members, and that refers to gatekeepers and coaches and all kinds of people, investors, who they were very intrinsically motivated, and they stated that the social impact was the highest motivation for them to be there and support and invest into those ventures. However, by dragging the social entrepreneurs into this business-driven sphere, and by this lack of questioning the theory of change, they were almost reaching the opposite than their goal, but they would almost endanger and hamper the social mission that they originally set out to support. And that leaves us with a crucial dilemma for social entrepreneurs. So if they are pitching in front of such a business-driven audience, and when we speak about investors or other people who can provide valuable resources for the social enterprise, should they then intentionally dress up as a business if that helps them to connect to gatekeepers or potential investors? Or should they more stay true to themselves and their mission and maybe risk deterring potential investors, but thereby finding the people who are really aligned with their mission and really interested in what they're doing? Further research then, of course, could explore how this then plays out in the further life cycle of the social enterprise. So if you have a very business-oriented investor on board, how does that influence the life cycle and the development of the social enterprise, versus if you have an investor or supporter on board who is more committed to the social mission and to bring about social change? How does that then influence and how does collaboration then work? So that was about it. I'm happy for all kinds of questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I see there's already something going on in the chat.
Yes, there's one question by Abhishek.
So let me have a quick look. Abhishek, often in pitch situations where audience might be actual venture capitalists, social entrepreneurs suffer since they face on creating it.
So basically I want to ask that, I was attending this pitch and actually there were social entrepreneurs, but then venture capitalists often look for scalability, but in social entrepreneurs often, they don't really worry about scalability that much. They first want to make a definite impact, and they feel that their enterprise is good enough to make even a small scale impact first, and then probably later on they may think about scalability, and that is where they lose. So the VC says that, no, I'm looking for scalability. Where is scalability in your proposition? So how do you think that this bridge can be closed, or is it even possible to bridge this gap between the VC's want of scalability and social entrepreneurs not focusing on scalability that much?
That's an excellent observation and question. Thank you, Abhishek. So what we find in our data is actually that when speaking about scalability, different people would mean very different things. So for the social entrepreneurs and within a social discourse, scalability was often portrayed as scaling the social impact. Scaling the social impact could even mean, if you put that to the extreme, to give out your idea for free to your competitors so that they can implement it as well, and that you can together scale the social impact that you have. Whereas if you looked at the more business-oriented audience, maybe for them scaling meant commercial growth, which would never ever include sharing an idea with a competitor, but which would mean to expand your market share and to ultimately, be more successful than your so-called competitors and conquer more of the market. But that's already, a very nice example of the kind of, how these two worlds collide maybe, and how the two discourses are meet, and what kind of misunderstandings then arise. And speaking about your question, maybe one more comment. What we see in social entrepreneurship, I'm not so familiar, with the situation in India. So let me speak more about Europe right now, that we have quite a large number of very successful social enterprises at a small scale. And that we have an immense problem to help social entrepreneurs to scale their operations. And organizations like Ashoka are doing the best that they can to help them to scale, but still they don't succeed. And there are lots of different explanations for that. Some social enterprises are successful because they are embedded in a local context. Some are successful because they hugely depend on a very charismatic founder. And this person cannot be multiplied, to a larger degrees. There's a lack of financing options also. So there are many reasons to this. And I believe this is really where, venture capitalists, where they have their role in enabling these social enterprises to actually scale their operations, and from a locally successful initiative company to grow something that is maybe successful on a national level.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. Harish, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Karan. Thank you for the presentation. So, you have said that the paper which will be coming in JB had gone through 4 rounds of revision. So, if you could share the process, I mean, for young scholars in a brief. So, what was the original thing?
Karin, share your pain with us.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know, if you are a young scholar, an emerging scholar, maybe I should not share this story with you, because it may be too frustrating. So I'm not sure, if this is maybe a good idea or not. But it also tells you a bit about, if you read papers that are published in journals, then you sometimes think they were born like this. And this is a very nice example of actually how you see that it was a total opposite. And to give you another example, you have the word compare function, where you can compare 2 manuscripts. So at a certain point, out of frustration, maybe I decided to compare the version I was actually working on with the version that I had initially submitted to the Journal of Business Ethics. And there were almost zero, points that could be found, words that could be found in both documents. So they were completely different. Not even a sentence was in the document that I had that was the same than the version that I had originally submitted. And to tell you a bit about the experience with that manuscript. So my initial idea was that we tried to quantify qualitative data, which is often a bad idea. Still, I thought, I may try that, and I could go for that. And I also told you, how in a first attempt we actually invested a lot of time into counting the words and identifying, because I figured, if they use 30% of their words on the business discourse, this is something that we can actually empirically use them. And over the course of the revisions, step by step in each round, they forced us to completely kick out all of that quantifying quantitative information, and to just, they pushed us to go much further in terms of the discourse analysis, to understand what were the discourses like, how were they different, how were they mobilized differently by the pitchers and the audience, as opposed to looking at, because what we have, at least for the German sample, for the Berlin and Hamburg sample, we know which of these social startups were supported in the end and which weren't. So we have an indicator of success. Which of these social enterprises were successful with the audience and who weren't? So we can say yes or no there. And we also have the quantitative data on the amount of text that was used. So I thought, well, it could be really cool to show, and that's what we did in the first paper, that we can actually show that the business, the pitchers who would use a lot of business discourse tended to be much more successful than those who would use a social discourse. And the more they talked about the social impact they had, the less likely they were to get supported by the audience. Unfortunately, they didn't buy that, and to my regret, we had to step by step get rid of that. And to the painful story here is that I was very emotionally even attached to that kind of story, because I thought it was really, really nice to see that, how actually the investors who set out to support, social impact, then in the end choose those organizations that are most like themselves, so that are most profit driven. But I also understand that maybe the empirical data was not convincing enough, that the story that we made was not convincing enough. And I was grateful, that they led us from one round, or led me from one round to the other, so that ultimately a paper came out that is now soon going to be published, hopefully.
Thank you for sharing.
Maybe I could also check, Karim, what did you face in terms of something specific in terms of video interviews that reviewers like or dislike? I've never used that. So
that's a good question. And I think whenever something comes along the way that is unusual, that catches the reviewer's interest. So when I started my career, people told me, well, social entrepreneurship and so on, that's a niche phenomenon. Why do you care? And nonprofit organizations, even, I'm also interested in volunteers. So people said, this is, niche, it's not interesting. And I made the opposite experience. So there are not many people out there who actually, try to publish research on nonprofit organizations, on volunteers, a bit more people on social entrepreneurship, but still it's a niche. So for me, that was actually an advantage. And the same holds true for methods. So if you use unusual methods, so if you collect data, for us, and I also tried to make that point in my presentation, for us, the winning argument here was that we had videotapes of the pitchers and their audience. So we had the data on both sides, and even on them interacting with each other. So pitchers responding to the audience. So we can show very nicely how an audience member asks a question and forces the pitch team to talk about, business related terms. And then you can even see, in the video how uncomfortable they get because they don't necessarily use the same vocabulary and they don't feel familiar with the vocabulary, and they would rather talk about, the social impact that they are generating. Yeah, and in terms of, analyzing the videos, the feedback that I often got is that we could do much more with the videos, which we haven't done. So, for example, we did not systematically look at the facial expressions. We did not systematically use the body language that they use. We did not systematically analyze the way how the slide decks and the presentations were designed and prepared. So that was definitely something. So there's a lot of mileage in that if you are able to collect some such kind of and in terms of the data analysis, for us, usually you work with interview transcripts. And even if you conduct the interview yourself a few years later, and sometimes, these processes take some time, you don't exactly remember how a person said something. And with the videos in the analysis, even, a lot of years later, and also in the revision process, it was very enriching to go back to the videos and very enlightening also, because in some instances, I had a clear picture in my mind after reading the transcript. And then after I revisited the video, I thought, oh, wow, that's interesting. This now I have a totally different view on how this person said something and why they said it in a certain way.
Interesting. Priya, please go ahead. Then I have a question from Sumit.
Thank you, Karen, for the wonderful presentation. I mean, especially the unique methodology that you have used was a good learning experience for me, at least. And one thing that I noticed that the data actually was, the video taping was done in 2013. So right now, like in India, there is a huge wave of encouragement towards social enterprises. I mean, there are certain incubators, especially, not many, but some incubators are especially working for encouraging and supporting enterprises who are working in this field. And there is an incubator who works for people with special abilities to encourage them as being an entrepreneur. So right now, like the question that you raised, that should a social entrepreneur should intentionally dress up to actually to help them pass that gatekeeping and potential investors. So I feel that there has been a increase in the number of impact investors also. So I feel that today at this point, it might depend on whom are you actually presenting, and also on the business model of the social enterprise. Like, who is on the paying side of your enterprise? Like, suppose if the segment of the population which you are creating some positive social impact, if they are on the paying side, then maybe they might have faced a little more difficulty in actually selling them to maybe impact investors might be more interested because they would focus more on the social discourse. But in terms of attracting the people who specifically look at numbers and look at what is the potential of sustainability and scalability. So if the business has the marginalized population is towards on the revenue generation side, so they might have to face bigger challenges. But if they have the paying side as a, I mean, customers or the customers who can pay, and maybe they are on the vendor side or people who are already involved, suppose in some crafts business, like there are different actually variations in these. So what my thinking in this is that or if the business model is suppose cross-subsidization model, then maybe so depending on these two combinations, like how is the revenue generation happening, and kind of who are you presenting to, whether you're going specifically to social incubators or impact investors, or you are presenting yourself as a solid business, as a business which is also solving a societal problem. So the combination of these two will actually determine how they should present themselves. And apart from that, actually one more interesting point, actually, I mean, we would love to know more from you that because you got to see the audience and the pitchers' interaction and the decisions, and how over a period of 7-8 years, whether they have actually succeeded or not succeeded. So maybe it is a very interesting knowledge to actually gain what actually to see that pattern. Can we actually determine the success of the social enterprises? Because it might start with a lot of passion, and what are the challenges that they faced? Like what actually led some to succeed and others not. So that would be very interesting to know maybe from you in your next paper. And this was actually a very good learning experience for me for this videotaping thing actually. Maybe we can do the same thing. We also can do something like that in our work.
Thank you so much. I tried to take a few notes, but I'm sure I'll miss one of the many aspects that you just touched upon. So please feel free to remind me. So you said, you know, since 2013, when we collect the data, much has changed. I totally agree. I think, you know, this is a bit of old data in that sense. And I tried to cure that by at least looking up which of those that we videotaped were still alive in 2020, so that we had a bit of a perspective into who was successful or not. You said that would be a worthwhile endeavor to look into. Absolutely, would be fascinating to understand why is it that some survived and others didn't, why that some actually thrived and others didn't. What I, for example, looking, I found that the sustainable clothing and fashion, they survive to a higher degree than others. Why ever that may be the case. And I think it was 3 who were very close to public administration and were born out of, you know, public services. All of them failed. So these are just observations looking, you know, at the data. So it would be interesting to understand. So how come that those that were somehow, you know, initiated within the public administration domain, is there a lack of entrepreneurial ability, or is that how come they failed, and how come the sustainable fashion and handbags startups were so successful, even though some of them were not successful in the pitch situation. You also said that, you know, how to pitch and which investors that depends, of course, you know, on the audience that you're confronting. So if you are, in our case, they were pitching actually in a social entrepreneurship incubator, so in a situation with experts in social entrepreneurship, with a specific goal of supporting social entrepreneurs, even those that do not have a solid business model yet. That's written in their mission. However, in those pitch situations, that they completely forgot about that aspect, because emphasizing, you know, specifically the jury members, they would not let anyone go through who wasn't able to show a solid business model. And of course, you know, the type of investor that you need and how you then present yourself depends a lot also on the industry or sector that you're in, and on the business model that you have. You said, you know, if there's a lot of alignment between the social and financial value creation, so if you have an integrated social business model where social and financial value creation go hand in hand with one and the same activity, or if you have a more differentiated business model where you earn money on the one hand side and need an investor to earn your money, and then you donate a share of that, for example, to a social cause, that would call for a different type of investor. I'm 100% with you there. And those would, and you would need to attract different types of investors. Yeah. And I hope I didn't forget anything now.
No, it was good, and we'll connect later. I mean, I have few more ideas to discuss with you in our later meeting.
I'll connect you both on email. Sumit, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question? Maybe I'll just read it out. So Sumit was asking, are these repackaged pitches, Karin, are they more likely to get investment within the data? Did you see a pattern there? Because what he's saying is that since there are only repackaged and not probably highly scalable, securing further funding rounds may have been difficult because of their repackaging. And therefore, they are more likely to fail as compared to the ones who stuck to their original plan.
Very good question. So first of all, we need to talk about, what is success and what is failure. So in social entrepreneurship, you can define success as economic success, but also as social success. So if somebody fails, do they fail because they don't survive economically, or do they fail because they don't create a lot of social impact? We tend to associate failure always with economic failure, because that's the one that you immediately, are they still alive? Are they growing? Are they doing fine? For us, it's not immediately, and easy to judge whether they're failing on a social impact level. And yes, I told you that this was kicked out of our paper, but from the data and from the initial versions of the paper, what I believe we could clearly, but obviously the readers didn't, I believe that we could show that the business-oriented pitches would get more funding, because, and I think, that's what Bourdieu says, if you want to, convince somebody, you have to find common places. So these common places that they created would immediately speak to the audience. So they were more successful because they created this shared space. Also, we talked about in the paper where investor and social entrepreneur would use the same kind of vocabulary, similar concepts, similar language, similar logic. Now you say they're only repackaged. Maybe only repackaged means that, maybe some of them were really very business driven, and that's why they presented themselves in a business oriented way. Others that were, more repackaged were maybe very successful on in terms of social impact, and that does not necessarily mean that they are not successful on the economic side. So you can be successful on both sides. So I wouldn't say only repackaged, but it was a way of presenting a venture, which doesn't necessarily tell you anything about their ability to scale economically, or to scale the social impact. And securing further funding rounds, I don't have any information on that, unfortunately. So I don't know what kind of funding they were raising afterwards, what kind of support they got, what kind of resources they were able to acquire after the pitch. So I only know how they were doing in 2020, but I don't yet have the information of how they actually got there. And yes, you have an excellent point. I think what would be really worthwhile to look at also in future research is, do you have to dress up to a certain degree to convince an investor? But then later on that may backfire if there's a mismatch. And to which degree do you have to meet with your investor in this shared space? So maybe, there's, a limitation to which degree you should dress up. But our data clearly shows, or at least the one that was kicked out of the paper, it's not in there anymore, but those pitches who would almost only focus on the social impact, none of them was successful. Irrespective of the business model, none of them was accepted to the program, but quite a few of them actually survived and were still alive in 2020. So there seems to be some kind of an initial threshold in terms of business talking that you have to do so that the investors are giving you their ear. But maybe there are limits, you know, to which degree you have to do that. But those who didn't use business for discourse were not supported by the audience, even though some of them were later then proved to be successful.
Sounds good. I don't see any other questions, but I guess you have a few future research ideas from our.
A long list, actually. So yeah, but it is of course you know, a question of whether I'll be able to collect that data. So I think it was a unique opportunity also at the time to be granted access to these actual pitch situations, and not only to be granted access, but to be even able to videotape and to get the permission to videotape that. So I think that was quite unique.
Also, I think getting future pitches, again, it's a little difficult. So you might get some other type of data, not necessarily videotapes, if one was to follow them. But, okay, so, and Sumit is actually in the library. So he's listening to a seminar from the library, so he couldn't unmute and speak over there. So that's the reason I get to read up his questions. Anyways, thank you so much, Karin, for taking an hour out of your schedule for us and sharing this very interesting study. I'm hoping we get to welcome you. I've been always wanting to have you here over to India for a research stay, or at least some visit, a short visit in some conference or some form or the other. We do have a new ESG center that will work on these topics. There will be a formal launch soon. So hopefully, you know, in the post-COVID world, we get to see each other very soon, most likely in India, and we get to welcome you and hear you in person the next time, I hope.
That sounds very nice.